Imagine standing on a wooden scaffold, the rough grain of the oak biting into your knees.
The air is thick with the stench of mud, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of sharpened steel. Around you, thousands of voices, the very men you once led into the fires of glory, are screaming for your blood.
They call you a traitor. They spit on the ground you walk on. The king, a man you once called brother, stares down from his high balcony with eyes as cold as a winter morning in the highlands. The executioner raises his blade, the sunlight catching the edge of the axe. But then, something impossible happens.
A single soldier breaks rank, then another. And then, the silence becomes more deafening than the screams. Why did this happen? How does a man go from being the most hated criminal in the realm to the one person an entire empire bows before?
Welcome to Chronicle Nexus, where today we are diving deep into a story of blood, iron, and a redemption so powerful it redefined the meaning of loyalty. This is the tale of a man they tried to bury, forgetting that he was the seed of the kingdom's survival. To understand the weight of the moment the army knelt, we have to go back to the beginning, to the gray mists of a kingdom divided. This wasn't a world of fairy tales. This was a world where a misplaced word could get your tongue cut out, and where the crown was often heavier than the head that wore it. Our protagonist wasn't born into royalty. He was forged in the dirt of the front lines. He was the commander who won the battles no one else would fight. He was the shield of the common folk and the sword of the throne. But in the corridors of power, success is a dangerous currency. It breeds envy. For years, he was the king's right hand. He led the Iron Legion, a force of 10,000 men who feared nothing but dishonor. They followed him not because of his title, but because he was the first into the breach and the last to leave the field. But as his popularity grew, so did the whispers in the royal court. The advisors, men who had never seen the underside of a shield, began to fear him. They whispered into the king's ear that a man loved by the army is a man who could steal a throne. They planted seeds of doubt, weaving a web of lies that painted his every strategic move as a calculated step toward a coup. The breaking point came during the siege of the Black Fortress. The king had ordered a tactical retreat that would have left 5,000 peasants in the valley to be slaughtered by the invading northern hordes. Our commander disobeyed. He stayed. He fought. He saved those people, but in doing so, he broke the royal decree. To the people, he was a hero. To the king, he was a threat who had openly defied the crown. This was the spark they needed. He was arrested, stripped of his titles, and branded with the mark of a traitor. His men were told he had sold secrets to the enemy, that his heroism was a mere distraction to hide his true allegiance. For months, he rotted in a dungeon where the walls wept with moisture, and the rats were his only companions. The world outside moved on. The king's new advisors took control, and the kingdom began to crumble under their greed. Taxes tripled, the borders weakened, and the Iron Legion, the commander's pride, was fractured, led by incompetent nobles who cared more for their silk robes than their soldiers' lives. The stage was set for a public execution, a spectacle to remind everyone that no man is above the king's law. As the commander was led through the streets in chains, the atmosphere was volatile. The people were confused. They remembered the man who saved their children at the Black Fortress, but the propaganda of the court had been relentless. "Traitor!" they yelled, though some whispered prayers under their breath. The commander kept his head down, his spirit seemingly broken. But as we look closer at the historical records and the dramatic retelling of this saga, there was something we didn't understand yet. There was a hidden layer to his treason, a secret move he had made while in that dungeon that no one, not even the king, saw coming. You see, while the world thought he was rotting in silence, he was actually waiting. He knew the northern hordes hadn't been defeated, they had only been delayed. He knew the king's new advisors were in league with the enemy. The treason he was accused of was actually a cover for a deeper mission he had launched in secret.
He hadn't just saved the peasants. He had secured a vital piece of evidence that would prove the corruption at the very heart of the palace. But he couldn't reveal it yet. He needed the army to see the truth for themselves. He needed to reach the point of no return. As the executioner stepped forward on that fateful day, the air grew still. The commander finally looked up.
He didn't look at the axe. He looked at his former soldiers, the Iron Legion, standing in the front row. He saw the doubt in their eyes. He saw the way their hands trembled on their sword hilt. He whispered a single word, a battle cry from a forgotten campaign, one that only his men would recognize. It was a word that signified a promise, faith. At that moment, the narrative of the traitor began to shatter. The soldiers realized that the man in chains was the same man who had bled beside them in the trenches of the Great War. They realized that the evidence of his betrayal was a fabrication designed to protect the true traitors standing on the balcony in their gold-trimmed capes. The tension was a physical weight, a wire pulled so tight it was screaming to snap. But it wasn't just about loyalty to a man. It was about the realization that the kingdom's soul was at stake. The commander's silence hadn't been a sign of guilt. It had been a test of the army's character. He was waiting to see if the men he trained were still soldiers of the realm, or merely puppets of a corrupt administration. The secret he held, the proof of the advisor's pact with the invaders, wasn't a document hidden in a chest. It was the very invasion that was beginning to crest over the horizon at that exact moment. The sky began to darken, not from clouds, but from the smoke of the vanguard fires appearing on the hills. The timing was chilling. The king panicked. The advisors shouted for the execution to be finished quickly. But the executioner stayed his hand. He looked at the commander, then at the hills, then at the rows of soldiers. The realization hit the entire square like a thunderclap. The traitor was the only one who had prepared for this. He was the only one who knew the enemy's true path. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy to an epic. This is where the power of a single man's integrity outweighs the decree of 1,000 kings. We often think of power as something granted by a crown or a title, but real power, the kind that makes an entire army kneel, is something that must be earned through fire and sacrifice. As we move into the heart of this conflict, we have to ask ourselves, what would you do if the world called you a villain for doing the right thing? Would you break? Or would you wait for the moment where your silence speaks louder than their lies? The commander stood there, his neck bare, the axe inches away, yet he was the most powerful person in the city. The king was screaming orders that no one was following. The advisors were pale, realizing their web of deceit was being shredded by the cold reality of an approaching war. And this last part is what we often miss when we look at these grand historical moments, the psychological shift of the common soldier. They weren't just disobeying a king. They were reclaiming their honor. They were choosing the man they trusted over the crown they feared. Before we continue into the heat of the battle and the shocking revelation of who the true architect of the betrayal was, make sure you're subscribed to Chronicle Nexus. We tell the stories that history tried to forget and the cinema tried to capture. Now, let's go back to that scaffold. The commander stands up, ignoring the guards. He looks at the horizon, then at his men. The first soldier drops to one knee, his armor clanking against the stone. Then the second, then the entire front line. It's a wave of steel and humility that washes over the square. The traitor is no longer a prisoner. He is the general once more.
And the real war is only just beginning. The silence that follows the clatter of 10,000 sets of armor is heavier than the executioner's axe.
In the high balcony of the citadel, the king, clad in silk and gold, grips the marble railing so hard his knuckles turn white.
He had planned a spectacle of justice, a public shaming to break the spirit of a man who dared to question the crown. Instead, he is witnessing a silent revolution. The air in the square is thick with the scent of rain and horses.
But underneath it all is the electric charge of a shifted loyalty.
Why did this happen? To the observers in the noble galleries, it looks like madness. To the commoners, it looks like a miracle. But to the men on their knees, it is the only logical conclusion to a story that began months ago in the freezing mud of the borderlands. You see, a crown gives a man the right to rule, but a general gives a man a reason to live. As the commander stands there, his hands still bound by thick hemp rope, he doesn't look like a victim. He looks like the center of the universe. His eyes aren't on the king. They are scanning the faces of his boys. The archers he pulled from the burning wreckage of the southern villages, the knights he shared his last rations with when the supply lines were cut. But as we watch this sea of steel bow before a condemned man, it turns out there's something we haven't understood yet. The world thinks this is about a single act of defiance. They think the commander is being executed because he refused to charge into a certain death at the Battle of the Black Valleys. They think it's about a soldier's right to say no, but the truth, buried beneath the official records, is far more dangerous. The commander wasn't just saving his men that day, he was protecting a secret that would dismantle the very foundations of the throne.
While the king sat in his heated palace, he had signed a treaty that would have sold the lives of these very soldiers to the invading empire in exchange for gold and safe passage for the royal family.
The traitor on the scaffold didn't just disobey an order, he intercepted the king's betrayal. He chose the lives of his brothers over the survival of a corrupt lineage. And the soldiers? They found out. They didn't kneel because of a whim. They knelt because they realized that the man they were told to execute was the only one who hadn't already sold their souls. This is where the conflict sharpens into a razor's edge. The captain of the guard, a man caught between his oath to the crown and his love for his mentor, steps forward. His sword is drawn, but his hand is trembling. He is the bridge between the law and the heart. The king screams from the balcony, a high, thin sound of panic, ordering the captain to finish the deed. "Kill him! Kill the traitor and every man who refuses to stand!" But how do you kill a ghost? How do you execute a man who has already died 1,000 deaths in the service of people who now worship him? The commander finally speaks. His voice isn't loud, but in the absolute stillness of the square, it carries like a thunderclap. He doesn't beg for mercy. He doesn't call for a rebellion. He simply says, "The oath we took was to the land, not to the gold that sits upon it." In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire kingdom flips. The traitor is no longer the man in rags. The traitor is the man in the crown. The soldiers don't just stay on their knees. They begin to chant. A low hum at first, like the sound of a distant storm, growing louder and louder until it shakes the very foundations of the citadel. It is the old hymn of the vanguard, a song sung only when a king has failed his people. As the tension reaches a breaking point, we enter the most critical phase of this confrontation. The nobility begins to flee the galleries, realizing that the walls they thought protected them are nothing more than stacked stones if the men at the gates refuse to hold the line. The king is left alone on his balcony,
a small, frightened figure silhouetted against a darkening sky.
And this last part is what we often miss when we look at these epic moments of history. We focus on the grand gestures, the kneeling army, the defiant hero, the falling king. But the real story is in the eyes of the executioner. The man holding the axe is a veteran himself. He has scars from the same wars. He looks at the commander, then looks at the king, and finally, he looks at the heavy blade in his hands. What happens next is the secret that changes everything. The executioner doesn't drop his axe in protest. He doesn't walk away. Instead, he turns the blade. With one swift, deliberate motion, he slices through the ropes binding the commander's wrists. He doesn't say a word. He simply hands the axe to the man he was supposed to kill. The commander takes the heavy iron, feeling its weight, a weight he has carried his entire life, in different forms. He looks up at the king, not with hatred, but with a terrifying, cold pity. The army rises. Not as a mob, but as a machine. The clank of their armor as they stand in unison is the sound of a new era beginning. The real war, as we said, is only just beginning. But it isn't a war between two nations. It's a war for the soul of the kingdom. The commander knows that by accepting this freedom, he is signing a different kind of death warrant. He is no longer just a soldier. He is a symbol. And symbols are much harder to keep alive than men. He looks at the front line, at the young soldiers who risked their lives by kneeling. He sees their fear, but more importantly, he sees their hope. And hope is the most dangerous weapon in the world. He raises the executioner's axe high into the air, the sun catching the blade for one brief, brilliant moment before the clouds swallow the light. The square erupts, but as the gates are kicked open and the march toward the palace begins, we have to ask ourselves, what is the price of this kind of loyalty? Is the commander leading them to a new dawn? Or is he simply leading them to a more honorable grave? The deeper we go into this story, the more we realize that treason is often just a word used by those who are afraid of the truth. But as the army moves forward, another secret begins to emerge from the shadows of the palace, a secret that involves the commander's own past. And a choice he made 20 years ago that led him to this very scaffold. Stay with us, because the next chapter of this saga reveals the one thing the commander feared more than the axe. And the reason why the king wanted him dead long before the Battle of the Black Valleys ever took place. If you're feeling the weight of this moment, if you're wondering how one man's integrity can bring an empire to its knees, make sure you don't blink. The shift from prisoner to liberator is never as simple as it looks. End of part 2. To understand why the blade was raised, we must first understand the weight of the crown that ordered it. To the world, King Valerius was a sovereign of divine right, but to the commander, he was a man haunted by the shadow of a shadow. You see, the friction didn't start at the Black Valleys. It started years prior, in the quiet halls of the Winter Palace. The commander wasn't just a soldier. He was a living reminder of what the king could never be, beloved without effort. While the king ruled through fear and the clinking of gold coins, the commander ruled through the shared bread of the trenches and the blood spilled on the front lines. The king saw the way the men looked at the commander, not with the trembling gaze of a subject, but with the fierce, unwavering devotion of a brother. And in the heart of a tyrant, that kind of love is more dangerous than an invading army. The king's plan was never just to win the war. It was to break the man who won it for him. He sent the commander into the Black Valleys, not to achieve victory, but to ensure his disappearance. It was supposed to be a suicide mission, a tactical nightmare where the terrain was a jagged trap, and the enemy outnumbered them 5-1. The king waited for the news of the commander's death, already drafting the eulogy that would paint him as a fallen hero, a martyr safely tucked away in the soil. But the commander did the unthinkable. He didn't just survive, he brought his men home. However, he brought them home against orders, and that is the thin, razor-sharp line where the treason was born. To save 10,000 lives, the commander had to defy the king's direct command to hold a position that was strategically worthless but politically symbolic. By retreating to a defensible ridge, he saved the army, but he bruised the king's ego. In the eyes of the law, he was a deserter. In the eyes of the men, he was a savior. Turns out, there was something about that retreat that we didn't fully understand until now.
You might think the commander was simply protecting his men out of a sense of duty, but the secret truth, buried in the archives of the court, reveals a much darker layer. The commander hadn't just retreated to save his soldiers. He had discovered that the king had intentionally leaked their positions to the enemy. The treason wasn't the commander's retreat. The treason was the king's betrayal of his own troops. The commander held this secret like a burning coal in his hand. He chose to go to the scaffold in silence rather than reveal the king's treachery, because he knew that if the truth came out, a civil war would ignite, tearing the kingdom apart and leaving it vulnerable to the very enemies they had just fought. He was willing to die a traitor to keep the kingdom whole. He was protecting the very man who was murdering him. As he sat in that damp, lightless cell in the weeks leading up to this morning, the commander didn't pray for his life. He didn't plot an escape. He watched the spiders weave their webs and thought about the faces of the mothers whose sons had returned from the Black Valleys because of his defiance. He accepted the chains. He accepted the bread and water. He even accepted the jeers of the crowd who had been fed a diet of lies by the king's heralds. But the king made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the memory of a soldier. He thought that by stripping the commander of his rank, by shaving his head and dressing him in the rags of a common thief, he could erase the legend. He thought that if the people saw a broken man, they would believe in a broken cause. But as the commander was led up the wooden steps of the scaffold, the air didn't feel like an execution. It felt like a coronation. The sky above the capital was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a storm that refused to break. Every step the commander took made the wood groan, a sound that echoed through the unnatural silence of the square. The king sat on his high dais, draped in ermine and gold, his fingers twitching on the arms of his throne. He wanted to see fear. He leaned forward, squinting through the morning mist, desperate to see a tremor in the commander's hands or a flicker of regret in his eyes. But he found nothing but a terrifying, calm clarity. The commander looked out over the sea of faces. In the front rows were the townspeople, angry, confused, shouting insults. But behind them, forming a steel ring around the square, were the legions, the Iron Fourth, the Silver Shields, the survivors of the Black Valleys. They had been ordered to stand guard to ensure the execution went without a hitch. They were there to signify the state's power over the individual. Yet, as the executioners stepped forward, a man whose face was hidden behind a rough black hood, the atmosphere shifted. The commander didn't look at the axe. He didn't look at the king. He looked at the men in the ranks. He saw the scars he had helped them earn. He saw the eyes of men who had seen the worst of humanity and found their only solace in the leadership of the man now standing on the trapdoor. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on the chest of every person in that square. The king's herald stepped forward, his voice cracking as he read the list of crimes. Abandonment of the crown's directive. Conspiracy against the safety of the realm. The high crime of mercy in the face of war. With every word, the soldiers grew stiller. It wasn't the stillness of discipline. It was the stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. They knew the truth.
They had felt the cold wind of the Black Valleys.
They knew that the mercy mentioned by the herald was the only reason they were standing there to witness this travesty.
The commander knelt. The cold stone of the scaffold bit into his knees, but he didn't flinch. He placed his neck upon the block, a piece of oak stained dark by the shadows of those who had gone before him. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the world vanished. He wasn't in the capital anymore. He was back in the mountain passes, smelling the pine and the blood, hearing the roar of the river and the shouts of his brothers in arms.
He felt a strange sense of peace. He had done his duty. He had kept his oath, even if the king had broken his.
The executioner raised the axe. The steel caught the first light of the rising sun, flashing like a beacon. The crowd held its breath. The king leaned in, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. This was it, the end of the threat, the end of the man who was more of a king than he would ever be. But then, something happened that wasn't in the script. A single sound broke the silence. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a cry of protest. It was the sound of metal hitting the ground.
One soldier, in the third row of the iron fourth, dropped his spear. Then another. Then another. And this part, the part that follows, is what the history books often skip over, because it defies the logic of power. The commander, sensing the change in the air, opened his eyes. He didn't see the axe descending. He saw a wave.
It started at the edges of the square and rolled inward like the tide. It wasn't a rebellion of swords. It was a rebellion of souls. The soldiers didn't charge the scaffold. They didn't draw their blades against the executioner. Instead, one by one, they did the one thing the king could not command and could not stop. They bypassed the king's authority and went straight to the heart of the matter. As the axe reached its highest point, the entire front line of the king's elite guard didn't move to protect the throne. They moved to honor the man on the block. The clatter of armor filled the air as 10,000 men, the entire backbone of the empire, sank to their knees in unison. The executioner froze. The king's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pale, cold terror. He realized in that instant that he might own the land, he might own the laws, and he might own the gold, but he did not own the men. The commander looked up, his eyes meeting the king's across the distance of the square. In that gaze, the roles were reversed. The man on the block was the master of the moment, and the man on the throne was the prisoner of his own fear. But don't think for a second that this was the end of the struggle. A kneeling army is a powerful image, but it is also a dangerous one. As the sun climbed higher, the question remained, would the executioner strike anyway? Or would the sheer weight of 10,000 silent souls be enough to break the king's will before the blade broke the commander's neck? The next few seconds would decide the fate of an empire and the secret that the commander was still hiding. The final piece of the puzzle regarding why the king really wanted him dead was about to be forced into the light. You think you know how this ends. You think the hero is saved and the villain is cast down. But history is rarely that clean, and the price of that kneeling army was far higher than anyone anticipated. Stick with us, because we're about to dive into the final, heart-shattering revelation that changed the course of the kingdom forever. If this story is gripping you, if you can feel the tension of that silent square, make sure you're subscribed. Because the conclusion of the commander's journey is a masterclass in what it means to truly lead. To understand why these 10,000 battle-hardened men, who only moments ago were ready to cheer for the commander's execution, suddenly fell to their knees in a deafening crash of steel and iron, we have to look deeper into the shadows of the royal court.
Why did this happen? Why would a man who had spent his entire life defending the borders allow himself to be branded a traitor without uttering a single word in his own defense? The answer lies in a cold, calculated web of politics that turned a hero into a pariah overnight.
You see, the commander wasn't just a soldier, he was a symbol.
To the common people, he was the shield that never broke. To the army, he was the father who never abandoned his sons. But to the king, a man growing increasingly frail and paranoid, the commander was a shadow that loomed too large over the throne.
The treason wasn't a single act, but a series of carefully planted seeds.
Forged letters discovered in his private quarters, gold coins from the enemy's treasury hidden beneath his floorboards, and the testimony of his closest aide who had been bribed with a title and a manor.
When the accusations were read aloud in the central square, the commander looked into the eyes of the men he had bled with. And he saw something more painful than any sword thrust. He saw their faith shattering.
But here is where the narrative shifts. As the executioner's axe was being sharpened, a single messenger rode through the gates, carrying a scroll that had been intercepted at the border.
This wasn't just any document. It was the final piece of a puzzle that the king's advisors had tried to bury.
As we peel back the layers of this conspiracy, there is something we haven't fully understood yet. The commander knew about the plot months before it matured. He knew his aide had turned.
He knew the king was signing his death warrant. Yet he didn't flee.
He didn't start a civil war, which he easily could have won with the loyalty of the garrison.
Instead, he walked into the trap with his head held high. Why? Because the commander realized that if he fought back, the kingdom would tear itself apart from the inside, leaving it wide open for the invading hordes already gathering at the mountain passes. He chose to be a traitor to keep the kingdom whole.
He chose to die a villain so that the institution of the crown would remain undisputed, even if the man wearing the crown was a fool.
The tension in that square, just before the kneeling occurred, was thick enough to choke on.
The messenger didn't just bring a scroll, he brought the captured enemy general, who, under the threat of the noose, confessed the truth.
The commander hadn't been selling secrets to the enemy. He had been feeding them false information, leading their main force into a canyon, where they were currently being decimated by a small elite unit the commander had dispatched in secret weeks prior. The gold found in his quarters? It wasn't a bribe. It was the personal wealth he had liquidated to pay for the supplies of those secret units. Because the royal treasury had refused to fund the defense. When the king read the scroll, his face went from the pale white of anger to the gray ash of shame. He looked down at the man in chains, the man who had protected him from his own incompetence.
But the king's realization was nothing compared to the army's. Imagine being a soldier who had spat on your general as he was led to the block.
Imagine realizing that while you were cursing his name, he was silently saving your families, sacrificing his honor so you wouldn't have to sacrifice your lives.
This is the moment where the atmosphere shifted from a public execution to a spiritual awakening. The first man to kneel wasn't an officer. It was a young scout, the very one whose life the commander had saved at the Battle of the Black River.
Then a sergeant, then a captain. Soon the sound of armor hitting the cobblestones was like a wave of thunder.
They weren't kneeling for a king. They were kneeling for a man who had transcended the title of general.
Yet, as we move into the darker corners of this story, we realize that the kneeling wasn't the end of the tragedy.
And the final part we often miss is the most haunting of all.
Most people think that once the truth comes out, everything goes back to normal.
We want the hero to be reinstated, the villain to be hanged, and the kingdom to rejoice.
But in the real world, and in the brutal reality of this medieval power struggle, the truth is a dangerous weapon. The commander, standing there in his rags, his wrists bruised by iron, looked at his kneeling army, not with pride, but with a profound sense of sadness.
He knew that by the army kneeling to him and not the king, the political fate of the kingdom was sealed. He had unintentionally become more powerful than the throne itself. In that moment of absolute loyalty from his men, he became the greatest threat the king had ever faced.
The kneeling was an act of love, but it was also a death sentence.
It proved that the soldiers followed the man, not the crown.
This is the psychological weight of leadership that most stories shy away from.
It's the burden of knowing that your virtue can be just as destructive as your vices.
The commander now faced a choice. He could take the throne by force, backed by the very men currently bowing before him. Or he could find a way to disappear, to save the kingdom from a different kind of war, a war of brothers. As we look at the commander's face in those final moments of the standoff, we see the exhaustion of a man who has given everything. He hadn't just fought the enemy at the gates. He had fought the corruption in the palace and the darkness in the hearts of his own people. The revelation that follows this scene is what truly separates this story from a standard fairy tale. It's not just about who was right or who was wrong. It's about the devastating price of being the only honorable man in a room full of thieves.
Stay focused, because we are about to witness the final conversation between the king and his general, a conversation held in whispers.
While the army remained on their knees, refusing to move until their leader was freed. What was said in those few seconds would dictate the next 100 years of history. It wasn't a plea for mercy, nor was it a demand for power. It was a secret that the commander had carried since he was a boy. A secret that connects him to the royal bloodline in a way that no one, not even the king, had ever dared to imagine. If you're feeling the weight of that silence, the gravity of 10,000 men choosing a traitor over a king, then you are beginning to understand the true cost of loyalty. The story is far from over, and the final sacrifice is yet to come. Prepare yourselves, because the ending of this saga is what turns a movie into a legend that will leave you questioning everything you know about justice and betrayal. The silence that followed the army's collective movement was not just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight, a heavy shroud that descended upon the battlefield, muffling the wind and stilling the very breath of the onlookers. The king, standing atop his gilded chariot, looked out at a sea of bowed heads, and realized for the first time in his life that his crown was nothing more than a circle of cold, indifferent metal. Power, he realized, does not reside in a throne. It resides in the hearts of those willing to die for a cause. And at this moment, 10,000 hearts were beating in unison for the man they had been told to hate. The traitor stood in the center of this human storm, his armor battered, his sword sheathed. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had finally finished a long, exhausting journey. He looked at the king, not with the fire of rebellion, but with a profound, soul-piercing pity. This was the moment where the script of history flipped. The man who had been condemned to a traitor's death was now the only man in the kingdom with the authority to grant mercy. But why? Why would a battle-hardened army, sworn to the crown, risk certain execution to kneel before a man who had supposedly betrayed their sovereign? To understand this, we have to look past the surface of the battle. We have to look at the secret the king thought he had buried in the ashes of the northern campaign years ago. You see, the commander didn't just lead these men, he saved them from a choice the king had forced upon them. While the king sat in his palace, drinking wine from silver chalices, the commander was in the trenches, trading his own safety for the lives of his soldiers. He had taken the blame for a tactical failure that wasn't his, accepting the title of traitor, to ensure that the families of his men wouldn't be hunted by the crown's inquisitors. The soldiers knew. They had always known.
They had carried that secret like a burning ember in their chests, waiting for the day they could finally let it roar into a flame.
This wasn't a mutiny. It was an act of cosmic justice. As the king screamed for his personal guard to strike, he found himself staring at the points of their spears.
Even his own shadows had turned against him. The tension was so thick, it felt as though the world might crack open.
The commander finally spoke, his voice low but carrying across the fields like a roll of distant thunder.
He didn't call for the king's head. He didn't demand the throne. He simply asked for the truth to be recognized.
And this last part is what we often miss when we talk about legends of betrayal and honor.
We focus on the swords, the blood, and the grand speeches.
But the most important part of this story, the part that echoes through the centuries, is the quiet decision made in the aftermath.
We often miss the fact that true leadership isn't about the moment of victory. It's about what you do with the power once the enemy is at your feet.
The commander stepped forward, not to strike the king, but to help him down from his chariot.
It was the ultimate gesture of defiance, because it showed that the king was no longer a threat. He was just an old man who had lost his way. The army didn't rise to cheer. They rose to march, not for a new king, but for a new era. They followed the commander out of the valley, leaving the king standing alone in the dirt, surrounded by the gold he thought could buy loyalty. This is the ending that turns a movie into a legend. It's the realization that the greatest sacrifice isn't dying for your country, but living as a villain so that your people can survive. The traitor carried the weight of the kingdom's sins on his shoulders, and in return, he gained an army that no king could ever command.
He became a ghost, a myth, a story whispered by soldiers around campfires for generations to come.
As we close the book on this saga, we are left with a haunting question. If you were in his position, would you have the strength to let the world hate you, as long as you knew you were doing the right thing? Would you choose the crown, or would you choose the soul of your nation?
The story of the commander reminds us that the brightest lights are often found in the darkest corners of history.
And that true honor doesn't need a herald. It only needs a witness. The legacy of this moment didn't end on that battlefield. It changed the way the world understood loyalty. It proved that you can chain a man's body, you can tarnish his name, and you can sentence him to the gallows. But you can never, ever break a bond forged in the fires of shared sacrifice. The king's name has been forgotten by the sands of time, but the traitor lives on in every heart that chooses courage over comfort.